Let's welcome to the show Nigel Yalden. Nige, good to see you, mate.
Yeah, lovely to see you too, Pat. Hope you're well, brother.
Yeah, doing okay. Busy. I'm sure not as busy as you, though. Just back from the World. Why the hell did you come back from the World Cup before the final?
Because I had a contract with Rugby World Cup Radio, and my contract was for pool play, and they extended it out. Asked me if I'd do the quarterfinals in Marseille, which I did, and then it was home. So hence the reason why I'm sitting here in Kirikiriroa having a chinwag with you today.
So Marseille, so that wasn't the AB's Ireland because they were in Paris, weren't they?
No, it wasn't. It was a different World Cup for me because I wasn't employed by a New Zealand radio station as I have been previously, and the role there is obviously to sort of lurk around and cover and watch and provide stories and content and commentate for the All Blacks. I was away. I commentated. I think it was 12 games in total. Did 14 of the 20 teams that played. But one of the 6 teams I didn't commentate with the All Blacks. But the great thing was I still had access to press conferences and the games themselves. Obviously, I watched pretty deeply. So, but yeah, it was just a different perspective from my point of view and a very different Rugby World Cup experience for me.
Now, tell me, was that Ireland-New Zealand game, that quarterfinal, the best All Blacks game you've ever seen?
You got to remember, we're talking about a long period of time for All Blacks. And in terms of my rugby watching, you got to go back to 1975 is when it first sort of came into my consciousness when I was about 3 years of age.
Okay.
That was the Scotland-New Zealand test at Eden Park, the famous water polo test. Is it the best New Zealand performance? Look, was it the best test? Look, that game in Sydney was always an absolute cracker.
Yep.
And that was widely regarded as one of the best test matches. I think it's definitely, with regards to test matches overall, Pat, I think it's got to be top 10.
Yeah.
And I think given time, and I think rugby matches are a little bit more like movies. You watch a movie sometimes, it's like in the moment, it's like, man, this is absolutely amazing, and someone might get an Academy Award for it. But then if you give it time, you give it 4 or 5 years, and people might sit there and go, well, actually, I think so-and-so should have won the Oscar for Best Actor there, or so-and-so should have won the director. I think as we look at this particular test that you refer to now, I believe that it's top 10 and rightfully so. I think as we give it a little bit more time, and I think you will find that this game is going to age insanely well, and it's going to creep up and up and up and up. And eventually, I think some people far more learned than I will probably sit there and say, hey, that's arguably one of, if not the best test match ever played. When you're given the 2 teams involved, how Ireland were playing, the New Zealand form, there's so many narratives out of that particular story. And then the quality of the game that we saw on the field. I mean, I bumped into Stuart Barnes the next day after it, and there's a guy who's watched so much rugby, insane amounts of rugby. And even he was saying, well, that's got to be up there as one of the best ever played.
I mean, no handling errors, 0. No scrums to Ireland, 0. I mean, you think about the bomb squad this weekend, and we'll talk about this weekend in a sec, and like the way that South Africa will win this weekend's test is through their forwards. If the All Blacks can do another performance like that, the forwards almost become irrelevant.
Oh, saying forwards become irrelevant in a rugby game is a really massive statement.
I said almost.
I understand what you're going there. I do understand where you're going there, brother. I do understand it. But look, I mean, that game was 2 teams whose intent was to play rugby. They wanted to have the ball in hand. Hence, when you see the opening series of that particular game was the All Blacks going through, I think it was 27 phases to earn a penalty and take a shot for goal. The closing of that game, 38 phases on attack. That shows you that the 2 teams wanted to play with ball in hand. Yes, they both had good kicking games, good tactical kicking games that they could execute, but they wanted to play the game with ball in hand. And so that's the reason why that was such a good game. 2 teams with similar philosophies, different styles of executing that particular philosophy, but both teams who just wanted to play rugby the way I think most people want to see the game of rugby played.
I do wonder, not to be negative, I think it was a 2019 Rugby World Cup. England knocked us out in the semis. Am I right in remembering that? It
Correct.
Feels like in that World Cup, England fired their best shot against us and knocked us out, had a plan, and then the following week against South Africa, they had nothing less. They'd played their best game in that. Have we played our best game? Was Ireland our best game? And is there a worry for that for this weekend?
I don't think so, because the All Blacks were able to get the job done with still a very efficient and still a very good performance, but without having to exert the same level of physical effort from the week prior against Ireland, against Argentina. It's quite interesting because you refer back to that, and there was a series of interesting comments about how New Zealand was targeting the Ireland game. England said they were targeting the semi-final, and then South Africa's saying, well, look, we were always targeting being in the final. And I think that's something a lot of teams have learned at this Rugby World Cup. Jamie Joseph in 2019 talking about the game that Japan played to get them through to the quarterfinal. So we have targeted that game for 4 years. Well, you can't target one game at a Rugby World Cup. You've got to win 4 big games. If you've got a big matchup in your pool play, you preferably want to win that in order to get the highest seeding, the supposed preferred seeding, a bit different at this World Cup because of the way the draw shook out. And then you've got to win 3 big games in a row, and you've got to get up for all 3 of those. And I think New Zealand knew it was going to be a big contest against Ireland, and yet they still knew that if they get past that, then they've got another step up, whoever they play in the semi-final, and then it's another step up again. So I think teams have learned from that last tournament not to say we're focusing wholly and solely on this particular game, because it does, you can have that emotional and physical letdown when you roll out the next week.
What I've liked about this Rugby World Cup compared to any others is that I remember having these conversations with people like yourself leading up to other World Cups, and pretty much it's always been, if the All Blacks perform as well as they can, we win, no matter what. This is the first World Cup, and specifically Ireland and France were the 2 teams, that it felt like if the All Blacks performed as well as they could, it's still not quite a guaranteed win. Because if the All Blacks perform as well as they could and Ireland performed as well as they could, perhaps Ireland still wins. But we've got past Ireland and we're not seeing France again. But I've enjoyed basically the underdog status. And we're going into this weekend's game, number 2 in the world, South Africa number 1 in the world, beating us 8 weeks ago. I'm not saying we're still underdogs, but it's not that if we perform to our best, we're going to win vibe. And I quite like that. It feels like a real contest.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I don't know if the All Blacks were the underdogs, but they were measured correctly based on their performances leading into the World Cup. I think every team was measured accordingly based on their performances leading into the World Cup. Ireland were the world's number 1 ranked team. They were on a massive unbeaten streak. They were playing really nice rugby. Experienced team. Everyone knows their roles. They know their structures. They execute to a really, really high level. South Africa know the game they want to play. France know the game that they wanted to play, and they were executing it really well, as we saw in the opening game of the Rugby World Cup. So I don't know whether the All Blacks were underdogs, but I think the performances leading into the tournament, for the first time in a while, because we had some different names, we had Ireland, who were legitimately an opportunity to win this thing. France, again, reasserting themselves, having made a lot of great strides under Fabien Galthié, under the work of Rafael Ibanez. And so I think what we saw going into it was a really accurate reflection of where every team was at that starting point. And now, again, I think we've seen how some teams have built, New Zealand most notably, with the way they've gone through, bouncing back from that opening loss, the first time they've lost in pool play, and then just slowly cranking away. Once they got the likes of those, Retallick back, Lomax back, De Groot back from the suspension, Frizzell, Geordie Barrett when he came back in after his injury to miss the opening game of the tournament. So I think that's what really stood out to me, and it is great to see.
Traditionally, and if you look back to 87 to 2011 as well, the All Blacks have had hiccups before Rugby World Cup, like losing the Tri-Nations or the Bledisloe Cup or something like that. That's traditionally been a path, and then they've won. This year, the All Blacks have been pretty good up until the South Africa-France losses. And I wonder if South Africa, of course, at Twickenham, I wonder if those losses have served that kind of purpose that, for example, not losing the Tri-Nations prior to previous World Cups. And not to talk about Ireland, but they came in on a 17 win streak, right? And you could see them kicking for corner rather than taking the three. That's the kind of stuff the All Blacks do when they're dominant. So they gave up a few points there. Do you think that those knocks and those losses leading up to this weekend are going to serve them well because they're realizing that they're not the dominant force this time around and they've got to watch their P's and Q's a bit more?
Well, I think you could say they haven't been that dominant force right throughout the Rugby World Cup cycle. And that we've seen that with the series loss to Ireland, the losses to Argentina, being up massively against England on the end of year tour and then squandering that to end up that game just being a draw. So, yeah, I think again, it comes back to they knew where they were at. They also knew that if they played to the best of their ability, that they can beat anybody in the world. And that still, I think, is the absolute case. The All Blacks will tell you they don't want to learn by losing. They want to learn by winning. That was one of the big philosophies from the Steve Hansen era that really has continued to flow on. But I think, yes, they have been very good at dissecting what has happened. I think it's interesting you referenced that game at Twickenham where the All Blacks got pinged. I think it was like 10 penalties in the first half. I think they had 8 or 9 inside the first 15 minutes. And it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I mean, that game for me, Pat, I always thought the Springboks looked like they were ready for a test match. New Zealand looked like they were ready for a warm-up game. And I still believe that. And I think that team that will run out, whichever team is named tomorrow morning, whatever team is named by the All Blacks against whatever team is named by South Africa, I think both sides have changed. South Africa subtly, I think New Zealand quite significantly, more so in terms of the confidence that they have now.
There's a very real possibility that the semi-finals could have been 4 Northern Hemisphere teams. If you looked at what the world rankings were with those games going on, Ireland and France, Wales and England, like that was a possibility looking the week before that could have happened. Why do you think it appears that Southern Hemisphere rugby is so good at the knockout stage of Rugby World Cup? I mean, the Northern Hemisphere's only ever won one. All the rest go to Southern Hemisphere teams, and they seem to step up when it comes to these knockout stages like the Northern Hemisphere teams don't. And arguably, the Northern Hemisphere rugby in this year has been more dominant overall than Southern Hemisphere rugby.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because when you look at Wales, England and Australia, all of them got new coaches late. And so all of them, you could say, had either changed course from the direction they were going. In the case of Australia, Dave Rennie had them going in this direction and Eddie Jones decided we're going to go in this direction. And I think that's part of the reason why they were sitting at home watching the quarterfinals. From a England point of view, I think they were always going to look. They haven't changed markedly what they were doing under Eddie Jones. And you could argue they're attacking less and they're wanting to kick a lot more. And then in terms of Wales, what Warren Gatland did was he got a bunch of younger players. Now, when you look at their particular quarterfinal against Argentina, one of the real differences was the experience of the likes of Augustin Cleary and Nicolas Sanchez coming on. They really helped Argentina in the late stages, whereas you had this Welsh team, which was still very young. Yes, they had some experience with the likes of Bigger. They got beaten up a little bit. They ended up with a backline that was quite fractured. And I think the experience does come into it. The Argentinian side, whilst not playing well, built really, really slowly, built nicely. Yeah. I don't think the margins were as great as what we think they are. I don't think there is as big a difference in terms of those small margins we heard alluded to. Argentina, I think, just played their right rugby at the right time in their quarterfinal. England, some very smart play, but I tell you what, Fiji pushed them really nicely as well. And we always knew that France, South Africa, New Zealand, Ireland, whatever the combination on that side of the draw was going to be, it was going to be a coin flip. And I think that is fair to say, even though you would have favoured France at home and Ireland at home, you knew the other two teams were capable. I don't think the gap is as great. I think the Six Nations gave us a really hard read because Wales were trying to rebuild a little bit. We always know Italy can be all over the place at the best of times. Yeah. And England, I think was still trying to find their feet, and they found it nicely at this tournament.
Yeah, right. All right, very quickly, I've got one question to finish off with, but first, before we do that, what's happening this weekend? Who's going to win? What's going to happen? What's the game going to be? I mean, I heard JK say in one of their shows this week, John Kerwin, that the job of the rugby player is to get to the final, and the final becomes a bit of a toss-up. So the All Blacks have done their job, and now they've got to try and win it. What happens this weekend?
Well, they just get to go out and play knowing that there's nothing afterwards. I understand exactly what JK is saying. Again, there's a train of thought that the semi-final is the hardest game to play because at the end of it, you are either going to a final or worse, you've got to play off for third and fourth.
Worst game
that's even harder to try and get yourself motivated for. So they got themselves to this particular point. As a player, you now know you've got this week. You can't play the game in your head too early. You need to pace yourself. You need to know that when you need to be peaking mentally, physically, emotionally, you have got to be doing that come 8 o'clock Sunday morning New Zealand time, 9 o'clock at night in Paris. You know that. You hear all the cliches. This is what a player lives for. It's cliche for a reason. This is what they want. Players want the chance to stand out on the biggest stage in the biggest game. And in rugby, there's nothing bigger than the Rugby World Cup final. So these players will know the expectation. The challenge for them is being able to meet that expectation mentally, being able to meet that expectation as part of a collective mental, physical, and emotional effort. And if the All Blacks can come together and they look, man, they're tight, Pat. That's a tight group at the moment.
Yeah.
So is South Africa as well. So I will always back New Zealand in these situations. I think for rugby, I want to see New Zealand win because I love the style of rugby that they play. I love the intent. Now, I'm not being disrespectful for South Africa. They've hit on a formula that works for them.
Yep.
But I would just love to see New Zealand win playing the style of rugby that they have played to this point.
All right. Hey, thanks, Nigel. One last thing that I'm going to say, you can respond to. It's not really a question. One of the reasons I really want to see New Zealand win is for Fozzie. Yeah. It's like I think he was treated pretty badly by New Zealand rugby. That if they were going to get rid of him, they could have got rid of him like England or Australia did and brought in someone else. They kind of went, well, before Rugby World Cup, you can apply for your job again if you want. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You're not going to get it. If he wins a Rugby World Cup as the coach, he will become World Rugby's Coach of the Year. And then New Zealand rugby, in my opinion, has kind of done him dirty by not allowing the process of the new coach to come up after Rugby World Cup. So obviously I want to see the All Blacks win because I'm a fan. Aaron Smith, have Whitelock be the only person in the world with 3 wins. It goes on, but there's a part of me, maybe it's the bitter part of me, I don't know, but it's kind of things that'll be great for Fozzie if they do this, just to put his stamp on it and move off to whatever opportunities he wants to.
Just remember, though, the reason why the All Blacks and New Zealand Rugby, I should say, chose to appoint the All Blacks coach early is because of what happened after 2019, where they waited. They sent out 26 invitations to people, inviting them to apply to coach the All Blacks, when the reality was there was only ever 2. They waited too long in that situation. There were teams that were appointing their coaches prior to Rugby World Cups and taking those coaches as part of the current coaching setup to the 2019 World Cup. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I think waiting until after a World Cup now to do the appointment process, I think, unfortunately, that's really outdated. So I agree that Ian Foster has had a challenging time with regards to it. He's gone through pandemics and other things as well. But I have no issue with the All Black coach being appointed ahead of time and for an entire Rugby World Cup cycle, as opposed to previously you'd get a year, then you get an extension, then maybe you get your extension going through to a World Cup. I agree with this because it puts in place certainty for coaches, for players as well with regards to that. So I agree. I'm very fortunate that Ian Foster has had a positive impact on me. I was a reporter around the time that he was involved with Waikato and the Chiefs and obviously with the All Blacks. He has helped me out with a couple of personal things away from the game, and I will be forever grateful for that. So I'm like you. I would love to see Ian Foster win, but there is also part of me that says, Pat, that New Zealand needed to do what they did to get themselves in line with what a professional sporting organisation should be, what a professional rugby nation should be at this particular time. But I won't deny, I'd love to see Fozzie with a winner's medal around his neck again.
It'd be amazing, wouldn't it? All right, Nigel. People can still find you at Nigel Yalden Sports on Facebook.
Yeah, still lurking around doing that, doing a podcast as well. So if that's of any interest to anybody, the Nigel Yalden podcast, that lurks around somewhere there as well. Not as big in numbers as what Pat Brittenden gets, but, we're trying. We're doing good.
Go on with your bad self, Nigel. That is Nigel Yalden on Rugby World Cup final and Rugby World Cup in June. Thanks so much for joining us, man.
Always a pleasure, my man.